Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. Today, I want to talk about mindfulness skills, the things that we are learning or developing through our practice. What are these skills and why pay attention to them? This topic is relevant to mindful movement because if we're going to practice mindfulness beyond the traditional sitting practice, or in an alternative way, or take the idea of meditation in a creative direction to make it more accessible or help it fit more realistically into our life, we need to consider, what are we cultivating? What is the essence that any of the techniques are trying to point us to? Basically, how do we know we're still practicing mindfulness? So that's what we'll get into today. Hopefully this will be a topic that helps you reflect on traits and wisdom qualities you'd like to develop and how you can do that in a number of ways. This is going to be a two-part discussion because my brainstorming produced a list of about 20 skills that I see coming out of mindfulness practice. Today, I'll talk about the first 9, so it should be plenty of food for thought. And in a few weeks, I will record a part 2 for this topic and cover the others. The episode was just growing to epic proportions, so we're going to split it up. Before we jump in, please indulge me for a small plug about the upcoming course, Ease into Meditation. This is my 8-week intro to mindfulness course, but with a little twist, because we start with movement rather than sitting still. It covers the same mindfulness principles and many of the same techniques and develops the same skills that you would find in most beginner-level mindfulness courses. But the idea was to bring those to life through movement. If you feel like having to sit still is holding you back from learning mindfulness, this might be for you. Or if you have a meditation practice, but it still feels like you're kind of up in your head a lot, these lessons are really designed to help you find a more embodied mindfulness. You do this course on your own schedule, but we're all starting together on January 28th and following the same lesson plan for 8 weeks. So you get an email guide each week, and then you do the video practices whenever you have time. There's more information on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga. So just go there and look for the Ease into Meditation course in the menu, or find the direct link in this episode's podcast notes. So let's talk about mindfulness skills. What are some of the specific skills that we are trying to develop when we practice mindfulness? A skill is something you deliberately train. It's not just innate qualities or personality traits or some kind of talent that you're born with. I'm going to talk about a number of mindfulness skills here, but a few examples could be deep listening, being in your body, decreasing emotional reactivity, kindness and compassion, identifying less with your thoughts. We also might talk about some of these as benefits we gain from mindfulness, but thinking about it in terms of skills brings in the element of deliberate intention, the purposeful aspect of mindfulness. I think this topic can help to flesh out our understanding of what mindfulness is and why we might put energy into practicing it, and why it's really a very rich, lifelong practice, not just another quickie technique or superficial buzzword. I'm also interested in the many creative ways we can experience and practice mindfulness. I've heard many people say some variation on running is my meditation, or I find mindfulness in cooking, or in art, or in my knitting. And I think that's absolutely valid. I myself am a big fan of practicing and teaching mindfulness through movement forms like Qigong and yoga, And my hikes in nature are very connected to my mindfulness practice. Maybe you can take a small pause here and think back to a moment in your life when you felt really present. Or think of an activity you enjoy that seems to help you quiet down and feel more centered. These are moments of touching mindfulness, and it's very helpful to recognize them as such. But to use an activity that's not traditional meditation to genuinely develop mindfulness, to really truly progress and experience the benefits of practice, we need intention and some idea of where we're going. So that's where the mindfulness skills come in. If we can identify some of the skills developed in traditional mindfulness practice, we can bring them into any meditation, movement practice, exercise, creative activity, or daily life situation that we want. And ultimately, this is great for any mindfulness practitioner, even the champion sitters, because bringing mindfulness into as many moments as possible in our day-to-day life is truly the goal. And just as a note, when I was researching this episode and brainstorming, I Googled the term mindfulness skills, and most of what came up with that was related to DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a well-respected mindfulness-based therapy. And apparently, they use this term, mindfulness skills, in their particular way and focus on 6 of them as an important part of their framework. So, I'm talking about something a little bit interrelated to that, but a little bit distinct from that, because for my purposes here, I'm thinking about mindfulness a bit more broadly, as a practice for human thriving and well-being, for deepening self-understanding, but also more spiritual aims like contemplating our ethics and integrity, reflecting on what it is to be alive in this world and this vast universe, and how we can develop wisdom through all of our experiences. All of that is part of the scope of mindfulness. So today I'm going to briefly talk about 9 skills I see coming from mindfulness practice. And in a few weeks, I'll do a part 2 and cover about 11 more. And I say briefly because each could really be its own topic, and this podcast could get very, very long. And we could probably come up with even more skills to include here. So it's not necessarily a comprehensive list, and I won't go too much into each of them, but I hope listing out some of these skills will kind of give you an idea of the scope of what we're doing in a full spectrum, complete mindfulness practice. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do like the term skill, because a skill refers to something you can develop. A skill is not just an innate quality or ability that only talented people have. We can all practice and develop skills. While mindfulness can be described very simply as being in the present moment or observing our experiences, there is also the potential for growth when we allow our observations to influence our choices in the next present moment. When we're present and aware, we have the power to cultivate a different way of being that is more and more skillful and beneficial. When I first started to practice mindfulness years ago and to study Buddhist philosophy, I loved how teachers would talk about actions being skillful or unskillful rather than good or bad, right or wrong. It really resonated with me. So rather than judging yourself as bad for saying something harsh to someone else, because we've all done that, or for eating more cookies than you meant to, or whatever, you observe that activity. Did it lead to well-being or distress? Was it harmful or helpful or neutral? Was it skillful or unskillful? And could there be other ways of responding to the reactivity in your system or the need you were trying to fulfill with that activity? This way of looking at it shows us what else might be possible next time without really indulging in that harsh inner critic voice, and shows us how we can practice the skill of responding differently. All of the mindfulness skills I'll talk about in these 2 episodes are really potentials we all have, but they need cultivation. They need nurturing. They can be recognized and strengthened, but it takes practice. And don't worry, because you don't need to try to develop them all at once. That would be totally overwhelming. This is a lifelong practice for a reason. And I'm sure you will hear how there's overlap and interconnection between the different skills I name. So when you focus on one, it tends to lead to or support others. Yay. Oh, and if you want to see these written out in list form and follow along with like a little visual aid, they are listed in the show notes on this episode's page at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast. So just look for episode 83 and you'll find the list. Okay, the first mindfulness skill that I'll mention is that of presence or present moment awareness, because this one is one of the most well known. It's part of most people's definition of what mindfulness is, right? To be present requires a willingness to drop distractions, to suspend our multitasking, and just attend to what's right in front of us in this moment. Often our attention is spread really thin and it gets pulled this way and that way by all kinds of stimulating things in our environment and even inside our own body and mind. So remembering to orient and reorient to the present moment, to what we're taking in through our senses right now, is a mindfulness skill. We practice this in meditation when we let go of thoughts and come back to our anchor, which we do a bazillion times. We practice it in mindful movement when we tune in to the pure sensations of motion or stretch or effort rather than planning, comparing, or analyzing. You can work on being present while cooking by just focusing on the details of chopping a cucumber, seeing it, smelling it, hearing the knife on the cutting board, rather than getting 3 steps ahead in the recipe. I love to crochet, for another example, and sometimes I practice presence by really feeling the yarn in my hands and being aware of all the little movements of making a stitch. This capacity to be present can serve us well in so many situations. It tends to feel more grounded or even peaceful, and it reduces feelings of being scattered, anxious, or overwhelmed. As a side note, if you're hearing funny noises on the recording, there's someone not too far outside my window doing some snow shoveling on the sidewalk because it's really icy out there today. So not much I can do about that. We're going to keep going. The second mindfulness skill I wanted to talk about is being connected to your body, embodiment. Many of us live quite a bit in our heads and miss out on the vibrancy of being embodied, comfortable in our skin, and aware of the important signals that the body might be sending. When we're in tune with the sensations of the body, it's easier to take care of our physical health and to regulate our emotions and our nervous system. That said, being embodied is not always easy. Sometimes we encounter pain or feel the intensity of changes in the body, or we feel very powerful emotions and how they affect the body. It's a skill to develop gradually and with care and support and kindness. Practicing the mindfulness skill of embodiment can sometimes be as simple as feeling for the sensations in your feet as you stand or walk, which can be very grounding. Movement practices clearly have a lot of potential to develop this mindfulness skill if we are paying attention to and respecting what we feel as we move. It's also possible for movement to contribute to disembodiment if we get in the habit of overriding stop signals, pain sensations, or fatigue. Sometimes dancers or athletes or even yoga practitioners are extremely skilled at using their bodies, pushing their bodies, but this doesn't necessarily mean they've developed embodiment as a mindfulness skill. Mindful embodiment has more to do with an orientation of consistently listening to the signals of the body, noticing the inner dialogues that motivate how we treat the body, and more trusting that the body has its own wisdom that we can learn from. Okay, our third mindfulness skill is steady focus. The ability to sustain our attention or steady our focus is another mindfulness skill, and one that we often refer to as concentration. This steadiness of focus supports us to stay in the present moment, to sustain our mindfulness, and not be so easily distracted or caught up by each thought that passes through our minds. And our mindfulness also alerts us to those moments when our focus has wandered. As soon as you go, oh, whoops, I'm lost in a story about this work situation. Let me come back to my breath. That is your mindfulness kicking back in. And this is a skill. When we first start to practice, maybe we can put our attention on something for a short time, like a few seconds, but sustaining it there is hard. We drift off a lot. If we practice coming back, we strengthen this skill. We get steadier and have more say in what we're paying attention to. And we are literally making changes in the brain as we practice this, strengthening the brain networks related to sustaining attention. So some of the skill building is actually physiological. That's why a lot of people like to use the analogy of training a mindfulness muscle, because the repetition of the skill changes the brain. And the more we've trained our brain to pay attention, the easier this gets. This cycle of setting our attention on an anchor, then noticing when it's wandered, then bringing it back over and over again is a big part of mindfulness meditation. But you can also practice it when you're out on a walk or a run and notice that you're worrying about something. So choose something to anchor your attention, like your body or breath or the sights and sounds around you, and keep coming back to that. Or another example, maybe you're listening to a piece of music and you're really right there with it until you notice that you're trying to remember the name of that band you saw once back in college. Not that there's anything wrong with reminiscing, but if your intention at that moment was to practice your mindfulness skill of steady focus, you'd want to come back to just hearing the music. Speaking of attention, there's the steady focus we just covered, and a distinct but related skill of being able to shift our attention. Have you ever noticed how sometimes it's hard to move your focus from one thing to another? I know I can get pretty stuck on worrisome what-if thoughts sometimes, and I have to practice pulling my attention away from that and placing it somewhere else. My teacher calls it changing the channel. People who experience chronic pain can also benefit from this skill. It's really helpful when you can take breaks from ongoing discomfort and move your attention away from the painful area, or zoom out and widen your attention so that it includes more than the pain. In meditation, we often notice that thoughts can be really seductive. Maybe I'm enjoying this pleasant daydream, but it's not the anchor I intended to pay attention to in this meditation. So I'm not developing much skillfulness while I'm zoning out there. It takes a real effort sometimes to coax attention back over to that ordinary in and out breath or that familiar body scan or whatever the technique. You also might see this when you get sucked into scrolling on social media or clicking on whatever sensationalized news headline pops up. Before you know it, you've lost a chunk of time and you might feel pretty icky or scattered after that. If you see that you're about to fall into that internet vortex, you could practice putting down your device, looking out a window, walking to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. You could stand up and shake or stretch, basically break the momentum, and then choose where you'd like to replace your attention. This is fun to practice in mindful movement as well by being deliberate with your attention. You can practice choosing to feel your feet in a standing pose, and then shift to feeling your breath, and then shift to feeling your back. Or try shifting your attention away from a stretch sensation that was probably an obvious place for your attention to land. Like, say you're doing a hip stretch. After you notice that initial obvious sensation, try to shift and see if you can feel your hand, for example. There are a million ways you could practice this skill of shifting attention. These past few skills I just mentioned that develop and strengthen our attention also support the skill of deep listening, which is number 5 on our list. Just by practicing mindfulness and closely tracking our own sensations, feelings, thoughts, and our interaction with our environment, we are learning to listen to ourselves much more deeply. This also trains us to apply the same attentiveness to our communications with others. Listening and being truly present in a conversation doesn't always come easy, but we certainly have lots of opportunities to practice it. When you're chatting with someone, you can practice letting go of other activities, like pause your TV show or put down your phone. You can just practice mindfully seeing the person, just taking them in. You might pick up on a bit more info from their body language that way. Slow your breath, settle yourself, really listen. Notice if any of their words spark any reactivity in you, perhaps irritation, excitement, or boredom, and keep coming back to the steadiness of being with them as best you can. Can you stay focused on what they're saying without getting too involved in planning your response? Mindful communication is a huge, complex, and super rich arena for practice, so I'll leave it with just this little tip of the iceberg bit here. But if you want more, I do recommend Oren J. Sofer's book, Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication. It is one of my all-time favorites. Okay, number 6, intention. Being intentional is another mindfulness skill. As we slow down, come into the present moment and pay attention, we act less from autopilot and more from intention. The way we learn to observe our experience moment to moment helps us to see things much more clearly. And as we see more clearly, it's easier to stay true to our deeper values and intentions. We get in touch with our sense of integrity, what we care about, what our values even are, what's most important. And we're developing all these skills and capacities that help us to make good choices in a whole myriad of ways. Our mindfulness skills allow us to prioritize what matters, rather than letting our attention, time, and energy get frittered away by distractions or other people's priorities. You can practice this by checking in with your intention before an activity. Like before a movement practice, what is my intention today? Or before exercising, what is my intention? A few examples could be, my intention in this exercise is to release stress, to expand my physical capacities, or to balance my nervous system. Or maybe it's simply to support my health, or to generate positive brain chemicals that lift my mood. These could all be intentions you take into exercise. Or what if you connected with intention right before you start your work for the day, before you open up your emails and start plowing through them? What is my intention? Or checking in with intention before you head into a meeting with somebody. So let's look at a 7th mindfulness skill, the skill of non-judgment. In mindfulness, we are cultivating a non-judgmental quality of attention. And the way I see this one, the way I like to think about it is, it's the ability to suspend our interpretations about what we're experiencing so that we can see them clearly in the present moment. This means disentangling our assumptions and the way we tend to evaluate and judge ourselves and our experiences and others and basically everything. I say suspend interpretation because it's not like we want to give up our ability to be discerning and become totally gullible. It's more like taking a step back and trying to see with fresh eyes that are not colored by habits or reactivity. Many of us also struggle with harsh and judgmental self-talk, like a negative inner voice. So finding the small ways we can practice suspending our interpretations and judgments is very helpful in deconditioning that inner critic. Mindful movement practice offers a ton of opportunities to practice this. We can start to notice those instances where we are comparing ourselves to how someone else in class looks in their yoga pose, or how they look in their yoga pants, right? Or how we tell ourselves we should be stronger or more flexible, or how we judge the body. Or let's say you're practicing mindfulness through a creative activity like drawing or writing. How creative can you be when you're criticizing every line or shape or word? You have to learn how to pause that judgmental voice in order to be absorbed in your creativity and see what comes out of it, right? So that's non-judgment, the practice of suspending our interpretations. And it leads a bit to the next one, number 8, which is being with emotions without getting lost in them. Some of you may be surprised to hear that emotions are part of mindfulness meditation if you have the image in your mind of meditation always being calm and peaceful. Like if you're looking for stock photos of people meditating, it would be a person sitting perfectly still on a mountaintop or in a still lake at sunrise with not a care in their mind. However, mindfulness is actually about observing and learning from all of our experiences, including our emotions and moods. Sometimes it's messy. So part of the process is learning to recognize and name emotions, like, oh, this is irritation. To notice how they register in the body, like, I feel the irritation in my tight stomach and jaw. In time, we begin to identify less with our moods and emotions. The key to this skill is the way that mindfulness teaches us to observe our feelings from the present moment, which is very different than the experience we've all had of an emotion leading us into a stream of past memories or stories anticipating the future. By observing our emotions and staying grounded in the present, we develop our emotional vocabulary and our capacity to allow feelings to pass through us, kind of like weather patterns. This is a great analogy that's often used to imagine you are the sky and your emotions and moods are the weather. Sometimes it's windy or hot or stormy or calm or frozen, but the weather always changes. It comes and goes with the seasons and atmospheric conditions. And the sky is still the sky, no matter what weather is happening. It's useful to recognize when an emotion or mood is present because it colors how we perceive everything that's going on internally and externally. Sometimes we don't know when we're looking through that lens because we're so lost in it. Mindfulness helps us learn to recognize that. And you can see how this skill connects with the skills of embodiment and being present, right? I often like to invite a little check-in with body, heart, and mind, including the moods and emotions, at the beginning of a mindful movement practice when I'm teaching. Because if there's a feeling there, we might need to factor it into how we approach our movements. If you've been feeling edgy and annoyed all day, do you think that might influence how you move your body? Or if you're feeling sad and heavy-hearted, knowing that will help you meet yourself with more gentleness and kindness in your movements. So the last one I'll talk about today, number 9, is decreasing reactivity. Cultivating the last 2 skills, non-judgmental awareness and mindfulness of emotions, very much supports this next skill of decreasing reactivity. Because as we learn to catch those habitual emotional gestures and see those reactions of liking, disliking, or feeling indifferent, now we have some choice about whether we're going to run with that feeling or not, or let it run off with us, which might be more accurate. When we're not aware, we easily fall into well-worn grooves of reaction. A particular type of thing happens and you spiral into anxiety and doubt. Someone says the wrong thing to you and the rocket ship of anger launches. We see something attractive and we go to town on wanting and having to have it. None of these emotions are bad or wrong, just to be clear. We all do all of them because we are humans, but we might not want to have them completely in charge and running unchecked. Mindfulness teaches us to recognize when a reaction is arising, to name it, to see it more clearly, and to choose how to handle it. It is amazing how much of this does show up when we're sitting totally still and meditating. And the practice offers a good container for looking at and learning to work with reactivity because things are relatively simpler when you're just on your meditation cushion. But to give some examples of practicing this outside of formal sitting meditation, what about when you're watching a movie or listening to music or certainly scrolling social media and reading the news? Can you observe how those things tug on your emotions? Reactivity is not just the emotion, but more like what happens when the emotion arises and we're not aware of it, and then we get lost in it and perhaps take a less than ideal action out of it. But through practice, we can learn to catch this process before it takes off and ultimately decrease our tendency towards reactive actions. So I'll continue in a part 2 episode in a few weeks and speak about the rest of the mindfulness skills that I've come up with. You can look at the whole list on this podcast episode page if you want to in the show notes. But hopefully, just from today's conversation, you're really starting to see the scope of what could be considered a mindfulness skill, what that kind of entails. And these skills are developed in the classical forms of mindfulness meditation and potentially in a mindful movement practice if we pay attention to them, or if you have an activity that you consider your meditation, like running or walking in nature or knitting or crocheting or cooking, whatever it might be. I encourage you to reflect on which mindfulness skills you are developing or might want to develop through an activity like that. That way you can steer your activity towards a deeper and more expansive practice that truly gives you the benefits of meditation. And you can get even more creative to use your favorite activities to explore more of the mindfulness skills that you haven't really worked on yet. So we'll leave it here for now and pick up this topic soon to discuss several more mindfulness skills. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for being here as always, and I hope you will enjoy your practice in all its forms. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.